Breaking news, the CSIRO just admitted that electricity from coal is cheaper than renewables. So why do the headlines say the opposite?
Huh?
Because the CSIRO's media release about their latest GenCost report is so cherry-picked and misleading, it says the exact opposite of what the actual data says. Keep watching to find out how the CSIRO buried the truth as we unpack the 2024-25 GenCost report. First up, let's take a look at the data behind this graph showing GenCost's latest cost estimates. We'll assume for now all of the CSIRO's assumptions are perfect, which they're not, but more on that later. In the 2024 analysis, black coal looks pretty similar in cost to solar and wind with firming. But when you look at the numbers, coal wins. It has a minimum cost of $111 per megawatt hour, which is cheaper than firmed wind and solar at 60, 70, 80, or 90% of the grid. And if we look at the midpoint of each of the ranges, coal is clearly cheaper than 90% renewables. While the midpoints for the other renewables shares may be slightly cheaper than coal, at the end of the day, it's the 90% figure that actually matters. Because according to the government's roadmap, their plan is to hit over 90% wind and solar in our grid. Now we come to the 2030 analysis, where you can see that renewables are clearly cheaper than coal. But that's only because GenCost assumes all supporting infrastructure built before 2030 is free. GenCost only cares about costs an investor faces, not what consumers end up paying for. That means Snowy 2.0, the major pumped hydro project which has blown out to $12 billion and counting, is assumed to be free along with a whole bunch of batteries assumed to be built between now and 2030. And that's not all. Every pre-2030 transmission project shown here, also free. If you just rely on the CSIRO's cost estimates, you might assume renewables being a cheaper investment in 2030 would mean consumer bills would be lower then too. But 2030 is actually when the bill will come due for several major transmission projects worth billions of dollars. The CSIRO's accounting trick that focuses only on costs to investors effectively masks the true costs that consumers will end up paying to support wind and solar. So how did the CSIRO summarize their results in their report? By crowning renewables the winner in 2030 and declaring a tie between renewables and coal in 2024. No mention of the accounting trick used in the 2030 analysis or the fact that coal beat renewables in 2024. And the CSIRO's media release? Cherry-picked and misleading from the start. The very first line says renewables remain the lowest cost new build electricity generation technology. And because very few people read beyond the media release, that false statement is what gets reported. Yet CSIRO's Director of Energy, Dr. Dietmar Torbia, still confidently asserted that GenCost reinforces CSIRO's role as a neutral source of scientific insight. I would love to hear his explanation of how that media release is neutral. But worse than that, Dietmar claimed that GenCost is transparent. And here's where things get really interesting. Because we've asked CSIRO repeatedly to release the details of their renewables integration cost modelling. You can check out this video for a full explanation. But what did they say in response? That their modelling is not suitable for general release. Oh, but don't worry, they're working on a better model which they will talk about maybe releasing next year. The fact that the CSIRO calls this transparency seriously calls into question their credibility as a publicly funded scientific institution. But hey, you might be saying, does coal technically being a tiny bit cheaper really matter? In the 2024 analysis, the cost range is pretty similar to renewables. Now, if CSIRO's modelling assumptions were reasonable, that would be true, but they're not. We and many others have pointed out the major issues with CSIRO's unrealistic assumptions about coal, nuclear, and renewables in previous GenCost reports. But still, many of these issues remain. You can check out these videos for a full breakdown, but in summary, for coal plants, the only option they consider is an expensive design never built anywhere in the world on a brand new site with no existing infrastructure. CSIRO also cherry-pick fuel prices to push the coal cost range even higher. While they choose very pessimistic capacity factors for coal, based on the assumption it would be ramping down to make room for renewables, the wind and solar capacity factors they choose are incredibly optimistic. Then we come to the integration costs for renewables. Between the draft and final GenCost reports, transmission costs blew out 25 to 55%. But the CSIRO doesn't seem to have factored this in. This table shows the committed transmission investments included in their model, and the total of $15.9 billion hasn't changed between the draft and final report. Oh, and 2 days after GenCost was released, it was revealed the cost blowouts were actually more like 100%, which the CSIRO definitely hasn't included in their model. CSIRO also seems to have ignored the warnings from experts a month ago that the battery capacity needed to support renewables will likely be more than double what was originally estimated. CSIRO's storage costs are therefore likely to represent a tiny fraction of the true cost. But because the CSIRO won't release their modelling, there is no way to test what would happen if all of the flaws in the GenCost model were fixed. We just don't have enough detail about their assumptions. But taking all of these factors together, it's pretty clear that fixing the CSIRO's flawed assumptions about coal and renewables would result in coal looking even cheaper than it already is, and renewables much more expensive. And if you still don't believe me, then ask yourself this question. If the CSIRO has said renewables are the lowest cost generation technology, then why do wind and solar need never-ending government subsidies? Energy Minister Chris Bowen just announced a 25% expansion to the capacity investment scheme, which takes your money and signs virtually blank checks to renewables investors. I mean, talk about a lack of transparency. We have no idea how many billions of dollars the government will end up handing over to these investors. And because the scheme is being run through a private company, there is zero accountability through Senate estimates or Freedom of Information requests. So we have no way of checking whether contracts were actually awarded based on merit. But anyway, as Professor Roscano said recently, there are now virtually no new investment commitments for solar and wind generation that do not have capacity investment scheme or other government underwriting. If wind and solar represent such an amazing investment opportunity, then why are investors only interested when the government is filling the trough? At the end of the day, the CSIRO can keep releasing GenCost every year, crowning wind and solar as the cheapest, but that won't change the reality that coal is cheap and renewables are not. Now, some may say the opposite is true when you factor in climate costs, but the social license for the energy transition is largely based on the belief renewables are cheaper purely on an economic basis. Violating consumer trust by perpetuating this false narrative is a surefire way to destroy social license for the energy transition. In the words of CSIRO's chief energy economist Paul Graham, the transition is going to have all sorts of unexpected costs, and it's just better to go into it with our eyes open. But until CSIRO releases their modelling, Australians will remain well and truly in the dark.